So good morning, everybody. First, thanks so much for having me here. I really appreciate, I always love to come to the Chattanooga area. I call it one of the most underrated cities in the United States. I think as soon as you fix that giant decaying warehouse on 24, that's the first thing you see of Chattanooga, then the city's really just gonna explode. But I'm just gonna go ahead and apologize a little bit in advance because I'm a night owl, so if this was at 9 p.m., you would see peak performance. But it's like 9 a.m., so I'm gonna be sputtering a little bit, but I'll do my best. I'm here to talk about the state of religious liberty in America, and I wanna talk about a paradox. So the paradox that exists right now in the United States is that as an objective legal matter, you are more free from government suppression of your religious expression than any time in the history of the United States. I'm going to say that again. At this point in the year 2023, you are more free from government suppression of your point of view than any time in the history of the United States. But here's the paradox. The paradox is that most of us don't feel more free. Most of us feel as if our expression is more perilous than it's ever been in the history of the country or in our lifetimes, that we might be canceled or we might face reprisals for our expression. So I'm going to explain why this paradox exists and what we can do about it. But first, let me make the case that we're more free than any time in the history of the United States of America. And I'm going to begin it because I want to set up two different concepts. Concept one is power, and concept two is liberty. Okay, what is the difference between power and liberty? Because what's happened in this country is the white evangelical church has lost power and gained liberty and doesn't like the trade. Doesn't like the trade. Okay, so if you have power, you feel free, right? A king feels pretty free. The king can do whatever the king wants to do. Why? Because the king has authority. The king is in control. Now, the king experiences that power as freedom, but it is not liberty. Liberty is what you exercise in the face of power. So liberty is the principle that limits power. So a nation led by a king, one person is free, right? One person, it's the king. But in a nation that has liberty, everyone is free, not to do everything that they want at any time, but enjoys a basic sense of freedom and liberty that they can exercise even if power says no. Even if power says no. And so why would I say that we have more liberty now, even if we have less power? Let's go back to the year 1977. A lot of people would say, well, the 70s were pretty bad in many ways, bell-bottom related, for example, music related. I mean, disco, are you kidding me? But a lot of people would say, and American Christianity was just, America was more hospitable to the Christian point of view in the 1970s. Church attendance was really high. A lot more people belonged to various denominations. The 1970s had their problems for sure, but one of them was not religious liberty. Au contraire. In the 1977, a Christian student group called Cornerstone tried to lease or rent or reserve space, an empty room in the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Just an empty room. All they wanted was to have an empty room to meet and to worship. The university asked them, why do you want this room? And they said, to worship. And the university said, nope, you cannot worship on a public university campus. Wait, what? No, I thought this was 50 years ago almost. 50 years ago, America was better for religious liberty. Nope, they said, in the mid-1970s or 1977, you cannot do this. You cannot do this. You cannot. Why not? Because that is mixing church and state. University of Missouri, Kansas City is a public university. You are a private religious organization. Y'all can't coexist. So it goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in 1981, the Supreme Court decides a case called Widmar v. Vincent, and it rules for religious liberty. It says, no, university, you have to allow student groups to meet in empty rooms. That seems to us so basic now, like the most basic thing you can imagine. But in 1981, when it went up to the Supreme Court, it was a matter of real contention and debate, because the easy cases don't really make it to the Supreme Court. The simple cases don't really make it. And so this really launched a wave of religious liberty litigation across the United States. Why was there a wave of religious liberty litigation across the United States? Because religious liberty was a secondary right at that point, a secondary right. And this is the work that I've done most of my life. So I got to law school in 1991. Okay, 1991, the state of religious liberty in America was terrible. It was terrible. But since then, it has been win after win after win. It's a little known fact. Some of you may be familiar with a musical artist called DJ Khaled. He wrote a song that goes, all I do is win, 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 win. He wrote that about religious liberty litigation. So beginning in the early 1980s, moving into the 1990s, the case after case after case after case reaffirmed two basic principles. One, religious liberty is not a secondary right. Religious liberty, free exercise of religion, is a right equivalent to free speech, is a right equivalent to freedom of assembly. It is a co-equal primary right protected by the Bill of Rights. And what that meant as a practical matter is the state could not disfavor religious expression. It could not engage in discrimination, viewpoint discrimination against religious expression. And it also meant that the state had to stay out of the affairs of religious organizations. In other words, it has to leave you alone. So a lot of this is just new. It's just new. So I remember being in meetings, the Religious Liberty Bar, the group of lawyers who practice religious liberty used to be so small, and religious liberty organizations used to be so poor that I remember going to like the first religious liberty conference of my career in 1992 in like a decaying no-tell motel in rural Pennsylvania, where a group of maybe 25 or 30 lawyers kind of from scattered organizations all across America met and got together and plotted out what can we do about religious liberty in America. And we listed some goals. Here was a goal. Student groups have a right of access to not just colleges, but to high schools. That was a goal. Student groups have a right of access not just to high schools, but to elementary schools. That was a goal. Student groups have a right of access, equal access to university funds and university funding. That was a stretch goal. Here was another one, to make sure that religious organizations are protected from state interference in their private affairs. That was a goal. Here was something we didn't even think of. Nobody was talking about it, at least in that meeting. There were some particularly far-sighted people talking about it. What if the state creates, say, a voucher system or starts to publicly fund private education? Can religious institutions participate in that funding? That really wasn't on our radar screen at that time. Wasn't on our radar screen. Here was another one. Well, if you do have religious institutions who receive federal funding and can participate in voucher systems and things like that, well, we want to make sure that the religious institutions can still hire and fire teachers on the basis of faith with no interference from the state. That was another goal. Every one of those has been met. Every one of them. And it hasn't actually been that close. You know, a lot of people, you'll get these fundraising mailers from activist groups, and they'll say things like, your religious liberty hangs by a thread. The next election could extinguish the church. You just know right away, they're lying to you. They're lying to you. They're trying to scare you into parting with your money. And I say this as somebody who believes that religious liberty is valuable and that religious liberty litigation is necessary. It was most of my career. But your religious liberty doesn't hang by a thread. If you look at these cases, case after case, they're not decided 5-4 with the 5 Republican nominees against the 4 Democratic nominees, or 6-3 with the 6 Republican nominees against the 3 Democratic nominees. Sometimes that happens. But as a general matter, when religious liberty comes to the court, it wins in a rout. Let's take, for example, the Obama administration attempted to bring the EEOC, in other words, federal non-discrimination statutes, into hiring and firing of ministerial employees, pastors, ministers. And that case went to the Supreme Court of the United States. They were trying to prohibit a religious institution from discriminating against an employee on the basis of disability. That case went to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States said if you're a ministerial employee, a pastor, a minister, then the state has to stay out. These federal non-discrimination laws cannot apply. They just can't. What was the margin there? 5-4? 6-3? 7-2? 9-0? 9-0. Okay. Recently, you had a case that came up. Catholic Charities was involved in foster and adoption work in the city of Philadelphia. And they had a rule that Catholic Charities has a rule in accordance with the teachings of the Catholic Church that they were going to only place children or recommend placements for children in families that had a marriage as defined by the Catholic Church. The city of Philadelphia said, no, that's discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. You can't do that. You cannot participate in our program any longer unless you comply with our non-discrimination rule. This case goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. It was decided in favor of Catholic Charities. 6-3, 5-4, 9-0, 9-0. Even some of these so-called stretch cases where religious liberty litigants were saying, okay, we've never been able to establish this principle, but let's go for it. Let's try. YOLO, right? Or if you're a gamer, Leroy Jenkins, which is, well, this is not the crowd for this. That's a World of Warcraft reference. And yes, I was a guild leader for a decade. Anyway, so this was a stretch goal. It was a stretch goal. What about, can churches participate in government programs that provide direct transfers of money or resources from the state to a church? This was a case involving playgrounds, a program allowing for the resurfacing of playgrounds, a state program to make them more safe for kids. That's not an establishment clause issue. It's not like the state is saying, well, we only want safe playgrounds in Baptist church schools. No, this was for anybody who wanted a safe playground, and a church applied and they said, no, we can't directly fund you. We cannot, because there's a state constitutional amendment that says we cannot support with state funds sectarian institutions. Supreme Court decided that case in favor of the church. The church got direct funding from the state. 7-2. 7-2. I can go through case after case after case like this. And so every time you hear a 9-0 or you hear a 7-2, you know that there are justices from both Republican, who are nominated by Republicans and nominated by Democrats, who have come alongside each other to protect religious liberty. Look at one of the most controversial cases of the last several years, a case called Masterpiece Cake Shop. This was a case where a man named Jack Phillips would not design a custom cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding. That goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. He wins, again, 7-2. Now, I'm not saying that all of these cases are that easy and that they're not all breaking down strictly on sort of those so-called partisan lines. We had a case called 303 Creative that was decided on those 6-3 lines, again, in favor of a person who was wanting to create a company that would design wedding websites, and said she didn't want to design wedding websites for same-sex weddings. She won 6-3. But that was split on partisan lines. But again and again and again, you're in a position where religious liberty has won. And this liberty extends to all of us. All of us. Mainline Protestant, evangelical, Pentecostal, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, you name it. People with no faith at all, atheists, also have equivalent rights to enter in the public square and to participate in the public square free from discrimination in the same way that religious groups do. In many ways, I remember there was a time not long ago that I went back and I looked at one of my old documents. It was like, if we succeed, if we do this, and this, we will have secured religious liberty in the United States of America from government interference. And not only had we accomplished everything on the list, we had accomplished some things that were not on the list at all. It's a remarkable development. Now, it requires vigilance to maintain it. There are people who challenge religious liberty all the time. The way I've described it, I've said the citadel of religious liberty is strong, the walls are high and strong, but the cannon fire against those walls is real. People do try to limit religious liberty. Absolutely no question about it. So there is a need to remain vigilant in the defense of freedom. No question. But at some point, I keep waiting for somebody to say to the American public, especially the American religious public, you have one more than you can possibly imagine. You have one more than you can possibly imagine. But that's not how we feel. We feel under siege. We feel beset on all sides. Now, there is a part of that that is real, and there's a part of that that is manufactured. It is manufactured anger. It is manipulation of emotions for political, cultural, or sometimes just financial reasons. But let me talk about the part that's real first. It is also the case that at the same time that our liberty is more secure than it's ever been, we are engaged in a very vicious culture war in the United States of America. Extremely vicious, extremely vitriolic, to the point where people will often feel if they say what they really believe, they will face a hurricane of anger and shame directed at them. And sometimes they do. And sometimes they do. There's this whole concept of cancel culture that people talk about. Now, cancel culture, when you talk about it accurately, is not the government moving against you. It's not cancel culture. The examples of cancel culture are usually not the government taking action against you, which is not to say that the government doesn't do it sometimes, but if it does, it loses. If it does take action on the basis of your viewpoint, it just loses. But when people talk about cancel culture, they're usually talking about, am I being fired from my job? Or am I facing a social media shame campaign at the hands of private citizens? Private citizens. Now, the Constitution 101 tells you that the First Amendment protects you from the government. It doesn't protect you, say, from me tweeting at you. It doesn't protect you from me being mean to you on Facebook, although I promised you I will not be mean to you on Facebook, mainly because I'm not on Facebook. I won't tweet mean things at you, mainly because I'm retreating from Twitter, because it's a cesspool of hatred, malice, and lies. But if you're on Instagram's threads, which for right now is an oasis of sanity and a sea of stupidity, I might have some polite disagreement with you publicly. That's going to be it. But it is actually a thing, and people don't like to be publicly hated. It is horrible. It is terrible. It is a terrible, miserable experience to be publicly hated. For some people, it is a shattering experience. And so what's happening is we have a culture that has become so sharp and so brutal towards each other, and I remember I just said each other on the political spectrum, that we feel stifled. We're not actually stifled, but we feel stifled, and we feel stifled for understandable reasons. I've experienced this firsthand. Absolutely experienced this firsthand from both sides of the spectrum, by the way. I'll never forget, I got into law school in 1991, as I said earlier. I went to college at Lipscomb University, and I'm not so sure of the rules here at this university, but when I was at Lipscomb, and from 87 to 91, that was a rock-ribbed, strict Christian school, friends. 11 o'clock curfew for students, except Friday night. Friday night, we could really unwind till midnight. No drinking, no dancing. In fact, the no dancing rule was so strictly enforced that sometimes RAs would drive around Nashville to various clubs looking to see if there were any Lipscomb parking stickers on the cars and then write down the license plates. The no drinking was so strictly enforced that in my dorm anyway, if you broke curfew, then you could be subject to a random breathalyzer. Now, not everyone got it, but you could be subject to a random breathalyzer, which led to this whole debate amongst students. I don't know if you remember sort of the rumor mill of the 1980s, but did NyQuil contain alcohol? Because if NyQuil contained alcohol, if you had a cold and you took NyQuil, you might blow hot on the breathalyzer and you're out of school. Well, I was on scholarship, so I just said, I'm not risking that. I'm going with Sudafed, okay? That launched my meth empire, but that's a whole other story. So this is the school I'm coming from, and then I go to Harvard Law School. Now, this is the first great wave of political correctness. Everything you see today about cancel culture existed on campus in the early 1990s, except turned up to 11. So this was the era when you would come in, and if you said something conservative that people didn't like, especially religiously conservative, you could be shouted down in campus. They would just literally scream or yell to try to drown you out. You had situations where people would put up posters of conservative students on campus with their faces photoshopped in the 1990s way of photoshopping by running off a copy of something, cutting out a picture, pasting it on the copy, and then running off another copy, literally of people who were conservative, their faces pasted over pictures of pornography and put on campus. I started with two friends, one of the first, if not the first, student-created pro-life club on campus. And we put out a letter to all of the students on campus that said, Harvard's health fee paid for elective abortions, but if you had a conscientious objection to abortion, you could write the school and they would refund a portion of your fee. It's a very small amount of money, but it was an important principle. And so I wrote a letter to everyone in the student body at that time, very nice letter, I promise, it's super nice, saying, hey, here's this policy, you can take advantage of it. Ran off, 1,400 copies, distributed them by hand. We didn't have email then, distributed them by hand to everyone's boxes, and I made a mistake. At the very end of it, I said, if you want to take advantage of this, fill out the form below, tear it off, and return it to David French, and I gave my box number and all of this. So the next day after I distribute this, I go to my mailbox after class, and I see it is stuffed with paper, just stuffed. Now, this was before I became a Reformed Presbyterian and didn't know about total depravity. So I looked at that box and thought, I just tapped into the latent pro-life movement at Harvard Law School, until I opened the first sheet of paper and it said, why don't you go die, you effing fascist? Whoa. Next one, go die. It was like people put out talking points that were, number one, wish his death, because I don't want to exaggerate. These were not death threats. They were death aspirations. We're not going to kill you, but we hope something or someone does. So death threat or death aspiration, call him a fascist, and use profanity in any combination of points 1 and 2. So that was my experience. And then that got me alarmed about the desire, the will that people had to suppress my free speech. It actually helped start my free speech, religious liberty career. And during that career, I faced some pretty wild stuff from the far left. I'll never forget having a campus hearing at Tufts University where about 100 protesters showed up to protest my Christian student group that I was representing. There were 4 students I was representing. They turn out all the lights in the student center. They darken the windows. And in the darkness, they hold candles to their faces and try to crowd us into a corner to physically intimidate us. This is on a campus in the United States of America. And I think it was 2000 or 2001. I remember, I'm the lawyer, and we've got these 4 students, and I'm trying to act like, oh, this is just a day that ends in Y. This is no big deal. And inside I'm thinking, what the heck is going on? That was from the left. 2015, everything shifted. Everything shifted. 2015, I wrote some things in National Review, very conservative magazine, opposing some of the rhetoric I was seeing out of the right. Instantly, within minutes of posting that I was concerned that some of the rhetoric that I was seeing from the right was was tapping into vicious racism. I post this in September of 2015, and within 30 minutes of putting up that post, I see the first picture of my youngest daughter, who's adopted from Ethiopia, photoshopped into a gas chamber and put online. Photoshopped into pictures of old slave fields. And that began what is an ongoing, on and off again, 8-year campaign of harassment and threats that my family has endured that I could talk to you about forever, that all came from the right. So there's a reason why people feel like they can be attacked for what they say. Why do they feel like that? Because they're attacked for what they say. But there's also an element of this that is manufactured. An element that's manufactured. For many of you in this room, this is the first time you've ever heard in your life that we're more protected from government censorship than we've ever been in all of American history. You probably, when you heard me say that, your automatic response was, you've lost your mind. Everyone knows that religious liberty is under fire more than it's ever been. Well, this is when people manufacture your anger and rage to serve their own agenda. Because if they can get you to believe that the fate of the church and the fate of the nation hinges on every election, every 2 years or every 4 years, or hinges on you giving them $25 or $50 or $100, then you know what you're going to do? You're going to swallow whatever objection you have to the character, to the integrity, to the ideology of the people who allegedly are defending you and protecting you, and march right in lockstep with them, right in lockstep. And the other thing that's going to happen is you're going to get mad, and you're going to get angry, and you're going to start to understand why people around you are mad and angry. And you're going to start to maybe even participate in the anger and the vitriol and the shame campaigns that make so many of us feel, that attack and have wounded so many of us. You might even forsake some of the highest Christian calls on your life to advance a partisan culture war position. Let's think about that for 1 second. Micah 6:8 is one of the most often cited verses in the Bible. You can go, here's a good way to know that you're an evangelical home. Do they have a Micah 6:8 picture on the wall or art? Micah 6:8. What does Micah 6:8 say? It says, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What it is good. It is to act justly. And a lot of us have that down, man. I know I need to pursue justice. I'm going to pursue justice good and hard on Twitter and Facebook by being as nasty and vicious and aggressive as I can possibly be. And that's my version of being a warrior. Man, what an overused term the term warrior is. The number of people I see online who call themselves warriors when all they do is tweet is hilarious. It's like the state of the country hinges on this outcome of this cultural battle. Well, Grandpa, what did you do in the great culture wars of 2023 upon which the fate of democracy hindered? Well, grandson, I tweeted like a jerk. Oh, Grandpa, tell me about this. I mean, it's absurd what we do now, absurd what we do. But we've got this down, right? Act justly. We're to pursue justice, of course. But what's the next part of the verse? Love mercy. Some translations say love kindness. Act justly, love kindness. Whoa, screech, wait. How can I be kind and fight for the state of the nation? Well, maybe being kind is one of the ways you fight for the state of the nation. And then what's the last one? This one's the hardest one of all. Walk humbly before the Lord your God. You know, here's one of the things that's really interesting. It seems like, to me, the more complicated the issue, the more righteous people feel, which might be the inverse of reality. Okay? So I served in Iraq in 2007, 2008 during the surge. And I remember flying into Iraq in November of 2007 with a lot of very certain ideas about the conflict, about the region, about the people. And then 10 and a half months later, I fly out with a lot less certainty. And this is something that's happened to me again and again when I encounter complex issues in the United States of America. How do we deal with the legacy of more than 300 years of state-sanctioned race discrimination defended by state violence? How do we deal with the legacy of that? The first way of knowing that you have no idea what you're talking about is if you come here and I say, I know exactly how to deal with that. That is an issue that, number one, you should recognize it. And number two, pursue justice with extreme humility. Because we don't know how, no one's figured it out yet. And yet you bring up race online. Do you think people come to you with a posture of humility? Viciousness. Gun violence in this country. Gun violence. How do we deal with the fact that amongst advanced nations in the world, we're one of the most violent countries, also one of the most violent countries on the face of the earth? If somebody comes to you and says, I know exactly how to deal with this, again, you can almost immediately know that they don't know what they're talking about because they haven't taken an actual close, open-hearted look at the issue. So act justly, love kindness, walk humbly. And how does liberty, let's circle back to liberty and then I'll take your questions. How does liberty fit into all of this? Well, one of the things that liberty does is it actually allows us to enact that exact moral framework. Freedom gives us the ability to pursue justice. When we pursue justice in an atmosphere of liberty, we're going to interact with our fellow human beings to whom we owe an obligation of kindness. And then when we hear their perspective, when it differs from our own, it should induce humility. There is a reason why the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote one of the most stirring calls to free speech ever written in the English language. In 1860, an abolitionist gathering, or it's late 1859, an abolitionist gathering in the city of Boston, this was the home of the abolitionist movement, was shut down by a violent crowd. In 1860 early, he writes a plea for free speech in Boston, and he calls free speech the great moral renovator of society and government. Why? Why? He calls it the dread of tyrants. Why? Because it exposes darkness to light. It gives darkness the opportunity, or it gives light the opportunity to expose darkness. And that's why I defend liberty. That's why I defend religious freedom. That's why I defend free speech. But do not let anyone tell you that in this country, in the year 2023, that your liberty hangs by a thread. It does not. It does not. In the year 2023, what hangs by a thread, in actuality, is our own moral responsibility in the way in which we exercise liberty. That's what's hanging by a thread. All right, I think we're going to take some questions, but I appreciate your patience at the crack of dawn.
David.
I hear you.
Testing.
Yeah.
David, thank you for a thoughtful and provocative presentation to start our conference. So since I want my daughter to know that I know who DJ Khaled is, we'll start with your initial premise that, religious liberty is winning.
Yeah.
And in the words of Charlie Sheen, as his career was unraveling, he said he was winning as well. And so my question is, why is the church behaving like Charlie Sheen while winning?
It's a great question. Because it depends on which part of the church, okay? So I would submit that what we've seen, for example, is in many ways, white Protestantism has receded in power, and many other mainstream white Protestantism, including mainstream evangelicalism, has receded in power. Other religious traditions have gained a lot more power and liberty. And when you hear people say that religious freedom is on the wane or the church is at risk, I often immediately ask myself, what is their religious tradition? Where are they coming from? Because I can guarantee you, the Catholic Church in the United States does not think this is the darkest day for religious liberty. So the Catholic Church in the United States was subject to extreme restrictions and prohibitions on its religious freedom. There's this thing called a Blaine Amendment, which a lot of Protestants know nothing about because it wasn't aimed at us. Blaine Amendments were put in state constitutions from coast to coast, specifically aimed at prohibiting Catholic institutions from participating in state programs. Now, they didn't, and the word sectarian in that time period was a code for Catholic. It was not a code for religious. Why was it not a code for religious? Because there were already Protestant religious schools. They were called the public schools. And so the public schools were Protestant religious schools, and they had a lot of Protestant religious elements. If you were Catholic, you didn't feel great there. So similarly, even in an even more extreme way, do members of the Black church in the United States of America feel more free in 2023 or 1923, right? Or 1953 or 1963? I mean, you name it. So when you look at the history of religious liberty in the United States, often you have to ask, who's upset? Who thinks it's worse? Because if you go back to the quote-unquote golden era, I can guarantee you millions of people in the United States of America are not saying, man, can't wait to get back there, because it was not the same experience for them. And so this is an issue that I've raised many, many times with my friends sort of in the white evangelical church is what concrete freedom do you not have? Like what freedom do you not have that you want to have? And the answer is often like not a legal freedom. What they really are wanting is to be liked, to not face that blowback that you see from other people. And then the next question I ask is, why are you getting the blowback? Now, sometimes you're getting the blowback in the same way that, Jesus or Paul predicted that believers in Jesus would receive blowback, that following Jesus can be offensive to the world, without question. Sometimes you're getting the blowback because you're a giant raging jerk. And there is a phrase that I hate so much. I'm sure some of you guys have heard this. If you're taking flack, it means you're over the target. In other words, the fact that you're getting pushback means that you're on the right path. That is the most lazy, destructive thinking I can possibly imagine. Because what it does is it insulates you entirely from criticism. If you're getting critique, you won't listen to it. You'll just view it as an affirmation. Because didn't Jesus say the world won't like you? Well, if the question is, why is the world not liking you? If the world is not liking you because you're exhibiting countercultural kindness when the world is demanding rage, I'm good with that. If the world is not liking me because I belong to and am defending an institution that has covered up systematic rape and sexual abuse, the world should hate me. It should be mad at me. Okay? So we have to ask, why is the world upset? And if it's upset because of our virtue, as it was with Jesus, that's part of taking up your cross. It's upset with us because of our vice, What we need to do is not be defensive, but be repentant. And that's not the spirit that I so often see in the public square.
So here is another question. So as you recounted some of the recent decisions, you noted that they were unanimous, or you had the liberals joining in with the conservatives to preserve religious freedom. So there is that perception that, well, the conservatives are for religious freedoms and the liberals aren't. How do you combat that perception?
Well, you have to combat. Now, look, I do not want to paper over that there are differences in judicial philosophy between the more progressive and the more conservative justices. They have different conceptions of the full scope of the First Amendment. But what I want to say is, and what people understand, is that when you're talking about religious free exercise and the First Amendment, free speech, the free speech clauses, the free exercise clauses of the First Amendment, there is an enormous, let me look at it this way. Imagine free speech, the free speech law as a beach ball, and everything in the beach ball is protected by the First Amendment. The argument at the court is how big is the beach ball, not whether the beach ball should exist, if that makes sense. In other words, is it going to be a giant beach ball or an extra giant beach ball? But there's still a big old beach ball. And so even if many members of the progressive minority on the court got the outcomes that they wanted in some of these cases where they did dissent, most of you in your daily lives would not notice that difference at all. Not at all. It's usually on edge cases. It's on cases involving niche issues. But on the broad parameters of the liberty of the church to hire its ministers, the liberty of religious institutions, there is an enormous amount of consensus. And one of the things you have to do is you just have to say that loudly and enough to at least add your voice to the mix. But there is also a responsibility on the part of the audience. An audience, people, if you are a person who's engaged in politics, if you're a political nerd, and if you're here at 9-something in the morning listening to talk on religious liberty, I'm talking to you, or the students who are here getting extra credit, then you have a responsibility as well. And one of the responsibilities, I think, is to broaden your horizons on your media diet. Get more perspectives. Here's one concrete piece of advice I would offer you is affirmatively seek out the best expression of the opposing side's point of view. That's a great way to begin to induce more humility and to humanize your opponent. When your opponent is humanized, it leads to greater kindness and mercy.
Here's another question from the audience. It says, thanks for your insightful presentation. How does your narrative of the unflagging growth of religious freedom from the 80s to the present square with the Smith decision undermining of freedom?
Yeah, that's referring to this case.
Can I add to that?
Pardon?
Can I add to that question?
Yeah.
Do you see the court in the near future addressing the Smith decision?
It's been addressing it. So what this is a case called Employment Division v. Smith. And this is a case from the early 1990s, interestingly enough, authored by, and this complicates so many narratives, authored by Antonin Scalia. Scalia wrote the worst opinion for free exercise of religion in the modern history of the United States. And what Employment Division v. Smith said was that if you are making a religious liberty challenge to a generally applicable rule, regulation, or statute, in other words, it's not targeting you because of your faith, it's just a rule that applies to everybody, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. And so basically, ever since Employment Division v. Smith, the court has been backing away from that. Also, right after Employment Division v. Smith, or a couple of years afterwards, Congress acted. And I'm so glad you brought this up because I haven't even addressed this, and passed by overwhelming bipartisan margins the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which serves as a kind of super statute that supersedes every other federal statute passed post-RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, has to comply with the requirements of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which essentially overruled Smith statutorily. Now, this doesn't apply to state and local governments, but it applies to the federal government. So post-Smith, there was a federal super statute that was passed that protects your religious freedom from federal interference. And then since then, Smith has been undermined in so many cases that it is essentially, for lack of a better term, it is what we call in the field zombie precedent. In other words, it's undead. It is roaming the land, still maybe slightly dangerous at times, but it's not one of the fast zombies. It's like one of the slow ones that even you can escape, like if you have a mobility scooter, you know? And so it is gutted as precedent, gutted, to the point where it's very difficult in the way in which the exceptions to Smith have become so broad. It's very difficult to find out where Smith still exists. And so it's like many cases, there are many cases in American history. Lemon v. Kurtzman is another one involving the Establishment Clause. Korematsu is one involving the internment of Japanese Americans. There have been multiple cases that year after year after year after year after they were decided, they were undermined and diminished, but they weren't overruled sometimes for decades. So Korematsu wasn't overruled until recently, formally overruled, but nobody thought that Korematsu was good law. Lemon wasn't formally booted really until like 2 terms ago, but nobody thought Lemon was still good law. And I can tell you this, if you're walking into court and your best argument is Employment Division v. Smith, you're probably losing. So it's been undermined, it's zombie precedent. Now it's like zombie precedent to such an extent, it's like rotting zombie precedent. I'm sorry, I can get really gruesome. It's just a head, like laying on the ground going, so you can just walk around it. But yeah, it's incredibly undermined.
All right, we're going to change directions for a moment. The question is, what kind of reception have you received at the New York Times? And is the hostility of some conservatives to the Times warranted?
Okay, what kind of reception have I received at the Times, and is the hostility warranted? Number one, people have been wonderful to me, and nobody has told me what to write and what not to write. So I have freedom, people have been great, but nobody should be shocked at this because, I don't know, has any employer that's ever hired you hated you? Like when you're hired, do they go like, you're the worst, welcome aboard? Like, that's not typically the way things work in human relations. They hire you not just because they might not necessarily, might like your work, but because at some level they wanted you. So this shouldn't shock anybody. But I found the workplace to be incredibly welcoming, incredibly professional. I have nothing but good things to say about my colleagues and the way they've treated me. Is the hostility towards the Times warranted? I would say there's absolutely, and the Times recognizes this, that there have been mistakes that it's made or there have been holes in its coverage. Dean Baquet, after the 2016 election, said openly on NPR, we don't get religion, for example. We have a hole in our coverage and a hole in our understanding in covering religious America. And they've really made moves to try to address that. So you have wonderful religion reporter Ruth Graham, who really understands the American religious landscape and especially the evangelical landscape incredibly well. David Brooks jokes that on the opinion side, if you take David, Pete Weiner, who's a contributor to the Times, for a long time Tish Harrison Warren, who had a newsletter until she voluntarily decided to not publish it, me, Esau McCauley, who is from Wheaton, who is also a contributor. He said, you can basically start a young life group in New York Times Opinion now. So absolutely, the Times has welcomed religious voices and does not stifle them at all. Here's what I say when people say, oh, you work for the fake news New York Times. I say, okay, I understand it's not a perfect institution, but what is your specific complaint? Specific. Usually then it falters or turns into something they read on a right-wing site that is often deeply flawed, right? And so often my question is then, who do you listen to? Who is your source, right? And many times the answer is Fox News. And I'll say, well, they just wrote a $787 million defamation check for lying to you systematically in the 2020 election contest. And you're trusting them? What? And sometimes they've never heard of it. They've not even heard of that defamation check. You know why? Because Fox News didn't cover it, or barely did, if they just caught the 5 seconds when Fox talked about it, or however few minutes it was. And so, again, a lot of times your own media diet, and then Fox is, on the right-wing media chart, is one of the more credible outlets. I would ask you to go, there's a website called The Writing, RIGHTING.com, and it will list the top 20 right-leaning websites by traffic. About only 4 or 5 of them are credible. About 15 or so are absolute sewers of misinformation, just sewers. And so, when people are going to Gateway Pundit, I don't want to hear them talk to me about the New York Times. It's physician, heal thyself. And so I think we have a big issue in that a lot of people put trust in media. It's not that we all think of ourselves as, you're the trusting one, I'm the critical thinker. We all trust someone or something. And the question is, who do we trust and why? And I get that there are valid criticisms to be leveled at the Times. I have leveled what I believe to be valid criticisms against the Times. But again, a lot of it is, okay, and compared to what? And that's where a lot of times the criticism really, really falters. Look, we know a lot of people who their lifestyle is they come home after work and they flip on Fox and it doesn't turn off until they go to bed. You are exposing yourself to just an avalanche, and not just of falsehood, but I would say, because it's not all falsehood, extraordinarily skewed commentary, extraordinarily skewed. And I can guarantee you, if you went to the opinion section of the Times on any given day, you're going to see a wider range of opinions. Just guarantee it. And so we need to always think about compared to what, and think about the responsibilities that we have for our own diet. And I'm not even talking about a lot of the truly fringe sites that a lot of people are reading when they're, quote, doing their own research. And that gets scary. That gets scary. I remember I had somebody not long ago confront me about something I'd written because Alex Jones had rebutted it. And I said, that, and I just went through the litany, and they said, you mean Alex has a problem with the truth? I said, man, we have responsibilities as consumers, and we in the media have responsibilities as producers. It's a two-sided thing. And so I fully recognize our own responsibilities. Everything that I write is rigorously fact-checked by super competent people, and I don't get everything right, even with me writing it, trying my best to fact-check it, getting a second set of eyes, trying to fact-check it. We're human. We make mistakes. Just yesterday, I published a piece where I misspelled somebody's name, which is one of the most irritating mistakes, because you've actually kind of hurt that person, because I was writing in a way that was complimentary of this person, and I didn't even spell their name right. Which, you feel terrible about it, but I have a responsibility to produce the truth. Consumers have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of truth. And I think that everything is reciprocal in this country, guys. Everything is reciprocal. You are not, as a citizen of a free country, you are never divorced from your own responsibilities. Never.
So here's a question from someone trying to fact check you regarding religious liberty winning. They raised the issue of prayer in school.
Prayer in school is not a religious liberty issue. So here's when prayer in school is a religious liberty issue. Prayer in school is a religious liberty issue if I, as a private student, as a private citizen, pray. So in other words, I form a Young Life group or a Campus Crusade group, Crew group, or InterVarsity or whatever, and I'm a private citizen, then I can reserve rooms, I can pray, I can bring my Bible to school, I can talk to my fellow students about Jesus. As a private citizen, I have the ability to pray. When you have school prayer coming from the government, that's not religious liberty. Okay? That's not religious liberty. That's government speech. Okay? So prayer in school cases involve situations where the government is speaking. That's an establishment clause issue. That is not a free exercise clause issue. I'm so glad for that question because it's a big misconception. So when you're talking about religious liberty, if somebody claims a religious liberty interest, one of the first things you want to ask is, who are you? In what capacity are you operating? If you're operating in your capacity as a government official, then your religious liberty, there are certain circumstances where there is a government speech doctrine where the government has some abilities to speak, but it's not precise to call that religious liberty. If you're a government official, you better be operating in your private capacity when you make the religious liberty claim. Great case on this in the Supreme Court involving a coach named Coach Kennedy case. He was a high school football coach who prayed after games. He did not claim to the Supreme Court that he was praying in his capacity as a high school football coach. He was praying in his capacity as the person, Coach Kennedy, and that he had an ability as a private citizen, even as a public employee, to pray. And the Supreme Court said, yes, even though you're a public school coach, you can, on your own after a game, pray. And if people voluntarily gather around you, that's on them. That's not you coercing them. It was a very controversial case. But the issue was, in what capacity are you operating? Are you operating in your capacity as a public official or as a private citizen? Private citizens have free speech rights. Public officials, as public officials, have establishment clause obligations, if that makes sense.
Awesome. And so here's another question. What articles or books have you written that make the case for an expansion or strengthening of religious liberty in the last few years?
Books that have made the case for an expansion of religious liberty.
That you've written.
Oh, that I've written?
Yes, that you've written.
Oh.
Or articles.
Articles all over the place. All you have to do is Google religious liberty, David French. I mean, I had so many, I've written in the Times in favor of the 303 creative decision. I filed a brief in the 303 creative case. I filed an amicus brief in 303 creative. During the pandemic, I wrote a bunch of stuff about protection of religious liberty during the pandemic, especially when it came to treating churches equally the way you would treat other places where large groups of people would gather, rather than discriminating against churches. There's too much stuff to count. My most recent book, though, is not about religious liberty. It's about polarization in the United States and how we hate each other so much this country might split apart. Right. And fights over religion are one reason.
Okay. And do you see anything or event that could occur in the near or far future that could limit religious freedom? What's that?
Yes, what a great question to maybe end on. What will threaten religious liberty? Us. We are the greatest enemy of religious liberty. Because see, here's what happens. Any right that you possess carries with it a responsibility. John Adams wrote, so I think of, when I think of the concept of what's called ordered liberty, which is a phrase that not enough people know about, I think of the two frenemies of the American founding, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson wrote powerfully about the obligations of the government when he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then in the very next words, he says, governments were instituted amongst men to protect these liberties. In other words, one of the core functions, not the only function of government, but a core function of government is to protect your freedom, to protect your liberty. And a government that does not protect your liberty is a government that is failing in its core function. Now, obviously, we know in 1776, when he wrote those words, they ended up being largely aspirational for way too long. There were entire categories of Americans who were not treated as created equal, who were not did not have their unalienable rights protected by the government. The government violated the social compact of the American founding from 1 millisecond after the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence. The new nation violated and operated in violation of its charter. Okay? And what part of the story of the American experiment is how did we navigate the tension between fallen humans and the fallen human reality of oppression and the high ideals articulated in our founding documents. If you look at every marginalized community in the United States of America who's made advances, whether it's a religious minority, racial or ethnic minority, etc., how have they made advances? They have appealed to the high ideals and said, you're not living up to the bargain that you made, okay? So government has the obligation, it is incumbent upon us as citizens to demand that the government meet its obligations. So that's one piece of this. The other side is John Adams' letter to the Massachusetts militia. This was written after the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution. In the whole letter, the letter is famous for one line that is often misused. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. Now, a lot of people say, well, that just means everybody needs to be religious or America's going to fail. No, the really important operative word there was moral, because we know a lot of religious people are not that moral. So the really operative word was moral, because if you read the whole rest of the letter, he talks about unless there is virtue in the public, that our vice, our greed, our ambition, our anger, and this is the vivid phrase that he used, will cut through the cords of the Constitution like a whale going through a net. So what does that mean? The great risk to our constitutional liberty is our own vice, greed, ambition, hostility, hatred. Because when any community becomes so hostile, becomes so hateful, becomes so malicious, becomes so vile, the outcry against it grows so great that the demand for the protections of liberty often slip away. And so one of the responsibilities that we have as Christians, as citizens, is to exercise our liberty for a virtuous purpose, in a virtuous manner. That is one of the key ways we can protect our liberty. It's not just by going to court and winning court decisions. You can do that. When I was practicing religious liberty, I used to give my clients an admonition, because I would often have these cases where there was a lot of public attention and press attention. And I would say the most important part of this case is not what happens in court, it's what happens after court. Because we can go in and I can win your case, but it's going to be up to you to exercise your liberty in a way that glorifies Jesus. That's up to you. And so I think the great threat to religious liberty, ironically enough, is religious people. How do we exercise our liberty? Do we exercise our liberty in a way and in a manner that into everyday, average, ordinary people who ultimately control this country merits that protection? And people are pretty tolerant of a lot of wildness and craziness. But when the dominant aspect of the exercise of liberty becomes brutal and oppressive, then the outcry to restrict that liberty becomes great. And so that is what we must keep in mind, and we must realize that we have deep and profound responsibilities. All right, I'm 35 seconds over, so thank you all very much.